Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Improving Your Cybersecurity and Cloud Playbook, Meeting the NYCRR 500 Regulations. My name is Tyler Suss, and I am the Marketing Communications Manager at Synoptek, and I'll be your moderator for today. Our attendees are all encouraged to submit any questions at any time into the lower left-hand chat box throughout the webinar. Let's introduce today's speakers. John Avery is our Information Security Advisor at Synoptek. John leads Synoptek Cybersecurity Advisory, threat hunting, policy development, incident response, and malware analysis. Carl Ramkaren is our Senior Service Development Manager. Carl leads Synoptek's work in managed public cloud, ensuring customers meet their required performance, compliance, and cybersecurity requirements. John, start it off for us today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tyler. I greatly appreciate the introduction, and welcome again to everybody here on the webinar today. Really appreciate you taking the time out to be with us. Before we get started, I think that it's a pretty good idea to get some house cleaning items out of the way, house cleaning items by way of a few definitions. Of course, let's start with the covered entity, which, of course, everything in this law hinges on exactly that, whether or not your organization is considered a covered entity. So what is that? Well, banks, insurance, mortgage brokers and servicers, check cashing, savings and loan, and others may fall under the covered entity umbrella. A really simple rule of thumb is if you're regulated by the New York State Department of Financial Services, then you're likely considered to be a covered entity. So that said, let's talk about NPI, or the definition of non-public information. And it's a pretty safe bet that everybody on today's webinar is familiar with what NPI, or non-public information, is. But if not, here is your crash course. NPI includes data such as social security numbers, driver's license numbers, credit card numbers, etc. And really, based on GLBA's privacy rules, NPI is any personally identifiable financial information that a financial institution collects about an individual in connection with providing a financial product or service, unless that information is otherwise publicly available. And the crux of the matter here is, what really constitutes publicly available? Well, as it turns out, publicly available hinges on whether you have reasonable basis to believe that the information was made lawfully publicly available. So you can't exactly count all the data in a dump to be considered NPI. All right, continuing our definition of non-public information, I wanted to throw this up here because I thought that it was very, it's something to consider, something very worthwhile. And as an extension of the definition here, as referenced in the 500 regs, there are some specific call-outs, if you'll notice here, to health and healthcare, which is interesting because these rules are, if you recall, strictly scoped to financial services. But it's important to keep these statements in mind because even if you operate in an organization that doesn't have to adhere to these regulations, we would still encourage you to think of these regulations as an experiment between state-level politics and information security. And regardless of which industry we operate within, information security is, of course, important to us. And I'm sure you'll also see that throughout our presentation today, it would be very easy for these regulations to be adapted to any industry where the protection of NPI is paramount. In the ebb and flow of any business, just like in information security, nothing is static. There are no destinations. Everything we do is a game of improvement and growth. All right. Earlier I spoke about the variety of businesses that may have to adhere to these new rules. But suffice it to say, there are a few exceptions, and they do exist. But without going too far into those weeds about exceptions, suffice it to say again that even if you are exempt, you still have to comply with, at a minimum, these rules right here. All right, so again, with the definitions, the house cleaning all set, and the exemptions out of the way, let's take a real quick look at the rules themselves. And of course, here they are in all of their glory, right? They don't look so scary, right? It's pretty easy. And while we aren't going to talk about all of these today, we are going to pick out the ones that we feel have been fairly challenging for our clients, so that you may gain some insight into how we approach these particular rules and problems. Today, I'm going to be talking and taking us through the very top section, the 180 days, at a fairly high level, because we're going to assume that you fit into one of two groups. The first group, your organization has already a program in place that addresses these requirements fully, which is, I think, really excellent. Applause. You'll likely be more interested, if you fit into this group, in what Carl's going to be discussing here shortly. And Carl's going to step you through addressing some challenges, some of these rules in particular, by leveraging fairly robust cloud solutions. Now, you may also fit into the second group. Your organization may be in the midst of addressing these rules, in which case you're in the right place, because there's only a handful of working days left to get this thing up off the ground. And I get it. I've been there. I've written essays the very night before they were due. But trust me when I say this, these rules are not like writing essays the night before. So if your organization is just trying to get this off the ground, I encourage you to connect with us after the webinar, and we can talk about helping you get your baton across the finish line. So let's go ahead and get started now. We're going to start our journey off on 500.02, the Cybersecurity Program. It's our first stop on many. I would encourage you to hopefully take this journey with me here. This particular component of the regulations plays the part of the foundation for the rest of what we're going to be told that we have to do by the Department of Financial Services, and honestly, among a lot of other regulatory bodies too. The program is pretty broad and likely shouldn't stop here, but at the very least, our program and your program should identify and assess our internal and external cybersecurity risks, promote a defensible posture from policy, access control, and infrastructure, support event detection and response, and at the very least, it, again, should set the foundation for any regulatory reporting obligations. Next up, we have 500.03. And of course, now that we have our program defined and nailed down, we need to design our blueprint. And this blueprint is going to speak to how the rest of the program functions organizationally. And this is achieved through very robust policy development. Now, whether your particular flavor is ISO or NIST or PCI or something completely different, Synoptek can accommodate. And even if you don't have a favorite flavor yet, well, that's where we excel. We can work with you to help you understand what may be the best fit for your organization, and we're really good at making those recommendations. 500.04a. So despite the fact that I'm moving through these in numerical order, you may find that it suits your organization's needs best to knock out 500.04a first before anything else. Let the new guy handle all the heavy lifting on the other regs, right? So we need to insert some sort of cybersecurity leadership into the mix. We need to hire a CISO, or a Chief Information Security Officer, or even better yet, if you're looking for a cost-effective alternative, a virtual CISO. Because this rule, of course, can be facilitated by a partner. Turns out I happen to know one. And these partners can help you out, usually at the fraction of a cost. Much like on-premises versus what I refer to as the CISO as a service. And cost effectiveness aside, you may find that because all of the businesses that must adhere to these regs are oftentimes tied together geographically, there is certainly going to be some fierce competition for the most talented CISOs out there. And not only does this really mean that comp plans are likely to go up, but perhaps even more importantly is the fact that with everybody fighting for the same talent, there actually may be a shortage of cybersecurity leaders in the Northeast region. 500.04b. So we've got our CISO in place now, and really contrary to popular belief, a CISO's job isn't just one that sees him or herself improving his or her golf swing from day to day. But really, one of the first things that our security leadership has got to get their hands around is taking stock of the state of the business and its security posture. And they got to report on it to either the board or some other senior leadership. And keep in mind, all of this has to be done within, I don't know, just a couple of working days left until this is due come August. Next up is 500.07, access privileges. And of course, by now we've got our program in full swing. Our policies are moving through development. Our CISO is in the middle of orchestrating all of the components. One major component is access control. And philosophically speaking, at its core, security means control. We need to understand our user and group privileges and access levels required for each user or group to perform his or her function. 510. Hiring personnel. Oh boy. Every year, on average, there's about 130,000 openings for information security analysts. But, believe it or not, only about 90,000 of those get filled, which leaves us with a pretty significant workforce gap. Adding to that pain is the fact that when it comes to jobs requesting cloud security skills more specifically, those remain open for about 100 days on average. And I know all of this. I know these statistics and this data. Not only because I looked at the data, but because I slept in a Holiday Inn Express last night. Hiring the right talent can be a very difficult task. And yet, that's exactly what this rule forces us to consider. How do we find the right candidate with the qualified skills to not only meet the regulatory demands, but to push our cybersecurity agenda forward? Really, I would encourage you to not think of this as a technical challenge, but it's really, truly a significant human resource one. So as I wrap up here and hand off the rest of the presentation to Carl, I wanted to leave you with a little extra nugget by way of Rule 509. While it isn't really part of the first phase that comes due here in, I don't know, again, a handful of working days, it comes due in March 2018. But what Rule 500.09 does is it requires a risk assessment. And what makes this important is that a risk assessment is a major foundational piece for not only proper information security hygiene, but also a major component driving a lot of other rules within these regulations. And of course, let's not forget about our third-party risk assessments either. So I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic over to Carl, who's going to shift this journey from the high level to a more granular look at some of the rules coming up. Carl, over to you.
Hey, John. Thanks again for letting me speak today around really how we are helping our customers in the fintech space really help meet compliance when they're in the cloud. So what I wanted to do was just kind of talk about some of the major players in the fintech space like FINRA and the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. And I want to highlight some of their opinions around what's happening today and how they're embracing the cloud. So in 2016 at AWS reInvent, the CIO for FINRA was interviewed, and he provided a good commentary on kind of the landscape and what's happening. He mentioned that private cloud is often pushed by people that want to stay in their comfort zone, and I think that's absolutely correct. I think people are familiar with that technology. They're familiar with doing things in a traditional manner. But he also observed that cybersecurity is actually better in the cloud, in the public cloud, than it is in the private data centers. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. In 2016 as well, too, the CIO for the SEC was interviewed. He mentioned 2 years ago the discussion was around security. Is the data in the cloud as secure as data on-prem? Right? That was the question. For us, it's more about the business use of the data and the business use of the cloud. Can we use the same tools to get the same performance from a cloud instance that we can on an on-prem, right? So I think the conclusion here is that cloud computing has reached a tipping point as the capabilities and the resiliency and the security of the services provided by these cloud vendors like AWS and Azure are really now exceeding those of many on-prem data centers. The combination of technology and commoditization with the scale and the competition from cloud providers are really driving the unit of computing costs down, storage costs down, networking services really down to zero, right? So the gap will, I think, continue to grow at really kind of an accelerated rate. And eventually it's going to leave what I call the laggards in cloud adoption, right, at an increased risk from resiliency in a cost perspective. The question of the past 10 years has been, hey, is it safe to, move processing to the cloud? The answer is yes. Today the question has really become what compromises, our market infrastructure is making by maintaining processing in an on-prem solution instead of an off-prem or cloud solution, right? So I wanted to focus on AWS right now, specifically looking at these regulations and how we would really leverage, the services that AWS brings to the table to help meet some of these compliance needs. So first, we have to understand the shared responsibility model. And so every cloud provider has a responsibility model that's shaped very similar, just like this, right? It's understanding that the cloud provider is really responsible for the compute, the storage, the database networking, right? The foundational services that really make up the services that they provide their customers today. But what the customer is really responsible for is really, again, what they're used to being responsible for, right? Which is the operating system, the network configurations, having data encryption or encrypting their data, understanding what's happening from a network traffic perspective and providing protection. They're responsible for the applications. They're responsible for the content, right? So it's understanding where that line of delineation is in that world, in the cloud world. Just because you use a cloud provider today doesn't mean it's their responsibility. So if we take a look at 500.5, penetration testing and vulnerability assessment, keeping in mind the shared responsibility model, it really does change our approach towards how we conduct and carry out penetration testing and vulnerability assessments. So in the traditional model, you were responsible for that infrastructure. You controlled the hardware, you controlled the software, you controlled the networking, right? Well, in a cloud provider model, that's changed. And the reason it's changed is because those actions are really indistinguishable from actual events, right? And so because of that, there needs to be a means or a mechanism for you to notify the cloud provider that you're going to, conduct these testing, right? AWS, for example, has an online request procedure, and so you should follow that. It's going to ask you for things like when it's being conducted, what are the IP ranges, what's the scope of the test and exam. Understanding which, EC2 instance you can run these on. So there are rules, right, in terms of what particular workloads can you actually run a penetration test and a vulnerability assessment on. So one should make sure that you understand, how that applies in your environment. Lastly, we should also make sure that you understand that at the end of the day, the customer is responsible for performing the penetration testing and the vulnerability assessment. So whether you're using a third party to help you conduct this, at the end of the day, you are responsible for bringing that party to the table to do that. AWS or Azure is not going to do that for you. 500.06, the idea of the audit trail. So in AWS or Azure, right, everything is all software defined now, right? Everything is managed by running a script, pointing and clicking, right? Everything is done all software based. So, because of the nature of cloud computing, right, it really does change the way that, we interface with these workloads and these services. What we want to do is in AWS, for example, we advise our customers to enable a feature called Cloud Trail. And Cloud Trail really helps provide a level of visibility around activity through the API. And because everything is software driven, many of these calls are API calls, right, to trigger things to occur, trigger things to happen. So because of that, we want to make sure that we audit what the identity of these API calls are, the time that they took place, the source IP, parameters that are being passed, et cetera, right? We want to catalog that, we want to capture that so that we have a means or mechanism to go back and analyze anything that may have happened, any type of security or breach or any of those events. We want to document what type of communication has been happening, to the API within the cloud. The other thing that we advise our customers to do is enable AWS config, right? And really the purpose of that is to provide, historical record keeping, right? Overall, what's happening in the environment, right? So it allows you to assess, audit, evaluate. We advise customers to establish baselines when they configure or build their environment so that we can go back and compare and understand what are the changes that have taken place over this course of period of time. Right? Also, because most IT environments are very distributed and you have different teams doing different things, it's always good to know or have notifications around what's happening, what's changing on those EC2 instances in your environment. Lastly, remember that, Cloud Trail and config, those are actually complementary, right? So we want to kind of take this layered approach and make sure that, it's not about using one or the other. It's about using both. Each of them address a certain need or function, making sure that you understand where those apply. 500.07, access privileges. So in AWS, there's a service called Identity and Access Management. So IAM is really kind of the key facility or service that allows you to command and control access into an environment from an account's perspective, right? So here's where you're providing or granting access to resources in that environment. It allows you to allow or deny access, create groups, tie them to job functions. So very similar to how you would create users and groups within Active Directory, kind of the same concept here, right? It's that we're putting together users and groups, and we're applying, access and privileges kind of as on a needed basis, right? One of the other things that we suggest our customers to take advantage of too is really stepping up kind of the security or the strength of just simply using a username and password, right? So we advise customers to start taking advantage of things like, multi-factor authentication. And AWS actually makes it pretty easy to implement a technology like that today. Bundle that with the fact that mostly everyone has a cell phone. We're able to leverage that technology in order to really quickly deploy and enable two-factor authentication to access services or functions within the organization's IT environment. And it kind of just rolls into, 500.12, which is really multi-factor authentication. Again, the idea is just to add additional layers of protection to, things that are easily remembered or easily written down, username and passwords, right? So a couple different approaches to take with multi-factor authentication, right? What we see right now is token-based authentication. AWS is building some built-in multi-factor authentication functionality. Today, it's currently SMS texting. That's basically in preview mode right now. So that's going to be an option. But a lot of our customers are taking advantage of things like Duo or RSA multi-factor authentication. Very easy to deploy and take advantage of. Encryption. So 500.15 speaks to encryption of non-public information, right? So I think what we need to do here is just make sure that we understand where encryption, how really encryption gets applied. So there's two approaches. There's one, data or protection of the data that's in transit, and two, at rest, right? So if we take the first one, right, in transit, how do we advise our customers to protect that? Well, a couple of different ways. Depending on the application, there might be some built-in security that you can enable, or, such as TLS, right, transport layer security. Other ways are building HTTPS or traffic security, certificate-based protection like 443 and securing web-based traffic using certificates. Those are typically the two. We also then talk about things like IPsec, right? So protecting the data that's traveling over the wire, we can incorporate things like IPsec from firewall to firewall, or firewall to router, et cetera. In AWS, we would enable that using or leveraging the virtual private gateway that's built into AWS's networking functions, right? Again, all software defined. Customers have also taken advantage of virtual appliances that are eligible to run within AWS. So when you think of things like Fortinets or Sonic walls, what have you, these software versions that run as virtual machines as part of, the software-defined networking or software-defined data center allows you to take advantage of things like IPsec, like the site VPN, et cetera. When we start looking at how do we protect data at rest, it's really about how do we protect the data that's sitting on spindle storage, right? So a couple different ways to do that. AWS has done a great job of allowing you to enable features built into their storage subsystems like S3 and EBS, right? So things like those storage platforms have the capability of enabling encryption at rest. That's an option we advise customers to take advantage of. If not, AWS allows third-party encryption mechanisms as well that are implemented within the operating system. Think of things like TrueCrypt, right? So with so many cloud services, right, and you just kind of take a quick look at what AWS brings to the table, there's so many options and so many services, right? We get customers that kind of look like this a little bit, right? They come to us confused and not really sure what they should be doing, right? So our thing is really keep calm and ask a cloud expert, and that's what we bring to the table. We want our customers to form partnerships with cloud experts that work in this field, that are constantly living and breathing cloud, and that can bring a lot of this expertise to the table. Right? A couple of things to remember, right? At the end of the day, you want to reduce your risk in cloud adoption and enablement, right? And we at Synoptek, we are capable of delivering support 24/7, 365, and making sure that your systems are constantly running maximum uptime. Some of the other things that we do that really help set us apart is really look at security and compliance and best practices. So our CAs are involved with you from an account perspective and constantly looking at your account and your infrastructure and finding ways to apply, the over 600 security and best practice checks and functions to your environment, right? It's part of our service. To us, it's all about a continuous compliance. We are always continuously trying to make sure that your environment stays up to date, is running effectively, and is in compliance. We also want to look at minimizing costs. And while that really wasn't the conversation today, it's also important to recognize that as organizations start to take advantage of more and more cloud services, cloud resources, you start to have a cloud sprawl. You have different organizations, business units, spinning up workloads inside the cloud. How do you manage that? How do you minimize the cost? So we're constantly looking at what's happening in your environment and providing right-sizing recommendations, right? You might have workloads that are oversized or undersized, right? We might have workloads that are very idle. There might be purchasing options like spot instances or reserves instances that you might want to take advantage of. So by bringing this to the table, we're helping our customers maximize how they spend in the cloud. And lastly, optimizing the direction, right? So, it's very easy to start taking advantage of cloud resources, but what's your strategic goal in the cloud, right? It's being able to partner with the right individual that has that in mind and can help you build out that technology roadmap for your business unit and for your organization. So lastly, what are the 4 takeaways? So if there were 4 things that I'd want you to walk away with understanding, with this particular webinar, is just understanding, hey, don't fear the cloud, embrace it, right? Make sure you understand where your liability is in the cloud, right? So we go back to that shared responsibility model, right? Make sure you understand, what the cloud provider is responsible for and what you and your team is responsible for. Understand that the cloud services can help augment your compliance requirements. So, again, just taking a look at the fact that we've gone over 5 different regulations today and how we specifically address those regulations, leveraging AWS and their features and functions. And lastly, make sure that you're partnering with the right cloud expert who can continuously drive a technology roadmap, drive expertise to help you meet compliance and those security requirements.
Thanks, Carl. I'll take over and close from here. So much of today's presentation covered what you need to do to become compliant with the new cybersecurity regulations. If you have questions on how to get there or simply do not have the bandwidth to implement the requirements, that's when engaging with Synoptek can really help. For covered entities on today's webinar, we're offering 1 free hour of security and compliance consulting. That's going to include a briefing with John Avery to determine if you're compliant with the NYCRR 500 regulations, help you develop a roadmap for becoming secure and compliant, and we'll also take a look at your overall cybersecurity posture and make some strategic recommendations. To schedule your complimentary NYCRR 500 readiness assessment, you can just shoot me an email on the screen at tsus@synoptek.com. That's T, S as in Sam, USS @synoptek.com. In addition to managed IT security, Synoptek provides a full suite of compliant IT services, ranging from end-user support to managed cloud optimization. Synoptek can work as either a full service provider for these services or as an advisor to your in-house IT teams. Synoptek is a leading managed IT service provider in the FinServ vertical. You can see here's a quick glance at some of our clients who we actively manage and support their critical IT systems. Again, thank you all for joining today's webinar. If you have additional questions or you'd like to speak with John Avery about your compliance status, send an email to tsus@synoptek.com. Thank you.